It began with the sudden rumble of engines and the distant echo of artillery, a sound that would come to define the lives of millions. Across Europe, ordinary families woke to a world that no longer felt safe. Streets once filled with the laughter of children and the rhythm of daily life were now crowded with uncertainty, hurried whispers, and the heavy burden of fear. For Jewish communities in Germany, Austria, and the newly occupied territories of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, this was not merely the start of a war, it was the beginning of a desperate flight for survival. Families packed what they could carry, sometimes only a few treasured belongings, and left behind homes, businesses, and memories, stepping into an uncertain world that often offered little welcome. The act of leaving was both a necessity and a heartbreak, the first in a series of trials that would test human endurance in unimaginable ways. By 1938, Nazi policies had already made life unbearable for Jews in Germany and Austria. The Anschluss of Austria brought waves of persecution, forcing families to consider emigration even before the outbreak of global conflict. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, shattered any illusions of safety, leaving synagogues burned, homes ransacked, and thousands arrested or terrorized. Refugees streamed across borders into neighboring countries, seeking safety in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Yet, the path to sanctuary was never straightforward. Immigration laws were restrictive, visas were hard to obtain, and host countries often demanded proof of financial stability or sponsorships. Desperate families waited for approvals that sometimes never came, trapped in a limbo where every day of delay increased the risk of capture. For many, the journey west was perilous, filled with checkpoints, travel restrictions, and the constant threat of detection by authorities sympathetic to the Nazi regime. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the refugee crisis intensified dramatically. Tens of thousands fled westward, only to find themselves caught between advancing German troops and borders that were increasingly closed. Belgium and the Netherlands, initially neutral, were flooded with civilians seeking escape, straining local resources and creating tension between refugees and host populations. France became a primary destination, absorbing waves of Jewish and non-Jewish refugees alike. Initially, the French government established camps such as Gurs and Rive-Salz, intended to house refugees temporarily. Conditions, however, were harsh. Overcrowding, insufficient food, poor sanitation, and limited medical care made survival a daily challenge. Despite the hardships, these camps became vital hubs for displaced families, offering shelter, community, and sometimes the only semblance of stability in a world upended by war. The German invasion of France in May 1940 marked a turning point. Refugees who had fled Germany, Austria, and Poland now found themselves once again under the shadow of Nazi occupation. The speed of the Blitzkrieg left little time for organized evacuation, and many civilians were forced to flee southward in chaotic convoys of cars, trucks, and foot travelers. Roads were clogged with displaced families carrying whatever possessions they could manage, and the air was filled with uncertainty and fear. Some sought safety in rural villages, relying on the kindness of locals or sympathetic officials. Others ended up in makeshift shelters or temporary camps under constantly shifting authorities. For Jewish refugees, the stakes were even higher. Identification papers were scrutinized, registration was mandatory, and many lived in constant fear of deportation. The act of displacement had become not just a journey, but a question of life or death. In Belgium and the Netherlands, the situation mirrored that of France but came with its own complexities. The German occupation imposed strict control over movement, housing, and employment, making it extremely difficult for refugees to secure basic necessities. Internment camps were established for foreign Jews, creating environments that were at once protective and restrictive. Families lived under constant surveillance, uncertain if their status would change overnight. Children were separated from parents, sent to boarding facilities or hidden with relatives and sympathetic locals to avoid deportation. In cities like Antwerp and Rotterdam, Jewish neighborhoods were transformed as refugees crowded into small apartments, schools were closed or repurposed, and daily life became a careful negotiation with fear and scarcity. Every outing, every interaction, carried the risk of attracting attention from authorities or collaborators, and civilians learned to live with a constant awareness of danger. Migration during this period was complicated by international factors. Countries like Switzerland and Spain offered limited refuge but imposed strict quotas, leaving many with nowhere to turn. Travel documents, often difficult to obtain, became lifelines, and forged papers became acts of survival. Relief organizations, religious groups, and clandestine networks worked tirelessly to assist refugees, providing food, shelter, and guidance for escape routes. In many cases, these networks operated under immense risk, smuggling families across borders, bribing officials, or hiding children from detection. The courage and ingenuity of those involved in these efforts became a crucial counterpoint to the horrors refugees faced, illustrating that even amid widespread persecution, human solidarity could make a tangible difference. Internment camps, though grim, were sometimes paradoxically safer than urban hiding or continuous flight. In France, Gers held thousands of refugees who, despite overcrowding and poor conditions, formed communities within the camp walls. Schools were established for children, cultural activities were organized, and underground networks began to take shape, sharing news from the outside world and providing a sense of hope. Yet the camps were also a constant reminder of vulnerability, as the occupiers could at any moment deport residents to labor or concentration camps. For many refugees, survival depended on vigilance, adaptability, and a willingness to navigate an ever-changing bureaucratic and physical landscape. The psychological toll of displacement was profound. Families were uprooted from homes they had lived in for generations, communities scattered, and social networks severed. Children faced interrupted education, the loss of friends, and the trauma of constant fear. Adults struggled to maintain stability while managing scarce resources, navigating unfamiliar legal systems, and protecting vulnerable family members. The uncertainty of daily life created stress that compounded over months and years, leaving enduring scars on the survivors. Yet even in these conditions, refugees exhibited extraordinary resilience. Communities formed mutual support systems, shared resources, and maintained cultural and religious practices as acts of defiance and preservation. By the end of 1940, it was clear that displacement would not be a temporary condition. The speed of German expansion, combined with systematic persecution, meant that Jewish refugees and other civilians faced prolonged uncertainty, scarcity, and danger. Migration was no longer simply an escape from immediate violence, it had become a continuous struggle against bureaucratic, social, and military obstacles. Survival depended on networks of support, adaptability, and courage, while hope was sustained by the faint promise of safety, either in neutral countries or in the hope of eventual Allied intervention. The experience of flight and displacement during the early years of World War II would leave an indelible mark, shaping not only the individuals directly affected but also the policies, culture, and memory of Europe for decades to come. Displacement, in this context, was not merely a physical movement, it was an existential challenge. Every day carried the risk of loss, every border crossing was a test of luck and determination, and every act of survival was a testament to human endurance. Families learned to navigate new languages, unfamiliar social norms, and hostile bureaucracies, while maintaining connections to the cultural and religious traditions that sustain their identity. In the shadows of war, Jewish refugees and other displaced populations demonstrated extraordinary resilience, forging lives in liminal spaces between fear and hope, persecution and survival, despair and determination. Their journey had begun with a flight into uncertainty, but it would continue as a story of endurance, courage, and the relentless pursuit of life in the face of unimaginable adversity. Survival in limbo. As the war pressed forward into its second year, the reality of displacement hardened into a daily struggle for survival. For refugees, the initial flight from home had not led to safety but to an uncertain limbo. Camps, temporary shelters, and overcrowded urban quarters became the new homes for thousands of families uprooted by Nazi persecution. In France, camps such as Gurs, Rivesaltes, and Les Milles were crowded with Jews from Germany, Austria, and Poland. Life in these camps was austere, rations were insufficient, sanitation poor, and medical care minimal. Families were packed into makeshift accommodations, sometimes sharing a single room with multiple households, yet amid the hardship, communities began to organize. Schools were improvised for children, workshops and small businesses sprang up to provide employment or barter opportunities, and religious observances continued quietly, serving as acts of defiance against the attempt to strip refugees of their dignity. The psychological strain was as intense as the physical challenges. Families lived under the constant fear of deportation, as German authorities gradually extended control over occupied territories. Rumors of mass arrests and transfers to labor or concentration camps spread through the camp networks, heightening anxiety. Adults struggled to maintain a semblance of normalcy for their children while grappling with their own despair. Children, meanwhile, adapted to the harsh conditions with remarkable resilience, forming friendships, inventing games, and participating in makeshift educational activities. Yet the ever-present threat of violence and displacement meant that security was always fleeting, and trust became a precious commodity. Those responsible for maintaining morale often did so quietly, sharing news, offering small comforts, or arranging clandestine gatherings that preserved a sense of humanity in the face of systematic oppression. Outside the camps, survival was equally complex. Refugees who had managed to find lodgings in urban centers or rural villages had to navigate strict registration requirements, curfews, and rationing systems imposed by both local authorities and German occupiers. Employment opportunities were scarce, particularly for Jews, who faced legal restrictions, discrimination, and exclusion from many trades. Many resorted to informal economies, selling handmade goods, taking odd jobs, or relying on support from relatives and aid organizations. Networks of solidarity, both formal and informal, became essential lifelines. Religious communities, charitable institutions, and underground organizations coordinated the distribution of food, clothing, and medical supplies. These support systems, though limited, were crucial for maintaining the fragile threads of survival, allowing refugees to endure periods of extreme deprivation without losing hope entirely. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was particularly brutal. Shortages of fuel and clothing left refugees exposed to harsh temperatures, and epidemics spread quickly in the densely populated camps. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, and illnesses such as typhus and influenza claimed lives that might otherwise have been spared in peacetime. Aid from international organizations such as the Red Cross was often delayed or restricted by bureaucratic obstacles and wartime logistics, leaving local communities to rely heavily on mutual support. Women played a central role in maintaining household and communal life, preparing scarce food, organizing education for children, and negotiating with camp authorities or local officials for resources. Their efforts were critical in sustaining the fragile ecosystems that allowed displaced families to persist despite overwhelming adversity. The broader political landscape complicated refugee life further. Governments in neutral or allied countries maintained restrictive immigration policies, wary of overburdening their own populations or provoking diplomatic tensions. Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal became destinations for a small number of fortunate families, but access was limited and often required personal connections, bribes, or forged documents. Smuggling networks emerged to facilitate escape, creating clandestine routes across borders, through forests, mountains, and along rivers. These operations were perilous, exposing refugees to arrest, imprisonment, or even execution if caught. Yet the determination to reach safety fueled ingenuity, courage, and perseverance, illustrating that even in the darkest circumstances, people sought ways to reclaim agency over their lives. In Belgium and the Netherlands, the daily struggle took on additional dimensions. Urban centers were crowded with both native populations and refugees, creating intense competition for food, housing, and employment. Jews faced mandatory registration, restrictions on movement, and constant surveillance, while others lived under the stress of potential denunciation by neighbors or collaborators. Families went to extraordinary lengths to hide their identity, using false papers, adopting assumed names, or relocating to safer areas. Children were sometimes sent into hiding, either with foster families or in convents and boarding schools willing to protect them from deportation. The moral complexity of these arrangements weighed heavily on both helpers and those being hidden, yet the efforts saved countless lives and demonstrated the extraordinary risks civilians were willing to undertake to preserve human life. Amid the pervasive fear and deprivation, cultural and educational initiatives persisted, serving as both practical and psychological lifelines. Schools within camps or in hidden urban locations offered instruction in core subjects, while clandestine libraries and discussion groups preserved literature, history, and religious teachings. Art, music, and storytelling became vital tools of resilience, enabling children and adults alike to maintain a sense of normalcy, express emotions, and assert identity in the face of systematic attempts at erasure. These cultural activities were subtle forms of resistance, sustaining morale, and forging bonds among refugees that transcended the physical limitations of camps or city apartments. The emergence of organized underground networks further shaped refugee survival strategies. Resistance groups not only targeted military objectives but also coordinated assistance for displaced populations. Safe houses, smuggling routes, and communication networks provided vital lifelines for those evading detection. Couriers transported letters, money, and documents. Sympathetic officials provided exemptions or delayed deportations. Local citizens offered temporary shelter. The courage and dedication of individuals operating within these networks highlighted a crucial point: survival was rarely a solitary endeavor. Community, solidarity, and coordinated action were as essential as food, clothing, or shelter. Every small act of assistance could mean the difference between life and death. By 1942, it became clear that displacement would define the war years for millions. Refugees lived in a state of continuous uncertainty, navigating bureaucratic obstacles, social isolation, and the ever-present threat of violence. Yet, amid hardship, people adapted, finding ways to survive, maintain dignity, and preserve cultural and familial identity. Life in camps, temporary shelters, and clandestine networks demonstrated remarkable resilience, illustrating that even under sustained oppression, human communities could organize, support one another, and endure. Refugees, though uprooted and vulnerable, became active participants in shaping their survival, asserting agency in circumstances designed to strip them of control. This period of limbo, though harsh and dangerous, laid the foundation for future acts of resistance, survival strategies, and post-war reconstruction. Families formed bonds across national and cultural lines, sharing resources, information, and emotional support. Children learned adaptability, cooperation, and the value of hope in a world turned upside down. Adults confronted moral, logistical, and ethical dilemmas daily, developing resilience that would carry them through the most trying moments of the conflict. The experience of survival in limbo demonstrated that even amid displacement, deprivation, and danger, human ingenuity and solidarity could persist. In the shadow of occupation and flight, refugees forged lives in constant negotiation with fear and uncertainty. Every day involved calculation, vigilance, and courage, whether in navigating camp life, traversing occupied cities, or attempting dangerous escapes across borders. The ability to endure these conditions relied not only on personal determination but on community, networks of support, and the quiet acts of bravery carried out by strangers and friends alike. The story of refugees during this phase of the war is a testament to human resilience, illustrating that even in the face of systemic oppression and displacement, survival was possible, dignity could be preserved, and hope could endure. Shadows of persecution. By 1942, the precarious existence of refugees had shifted into something far darker. The war, which had already uprooted millions, now brought with it systematic persecution. Jewish populations across Europe faced not just displacement, but targeted annihilation. Refugees who had managed to escape Germany, Austria, and Poland were increasingly at risk, even in countries that had once offered sanctuary. Occupation authorities in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands implemented strict identification measures, requiring registration of Jews, enforcing badge wearing, and confiscating property. These policies were accompanied by growing deportations to labor and extermination camps, transforming refugee life from a struggle for survival into a constant confrontation with the machinery of genocide. The fear that had once been abstract, the possibility of persecution, became immediate, tangible, and inescapable. For many families, this period meant living in hiding. Apartments, attics, and rural cottages became refuges against relentless patrols and informants. Everyday tasks, shopping for food, visiting neighbors, or walking to school, carried the risk of exposure. False identity papers, clandestine networks, and secret safe houses became lifelines. Those who could, moved multiple times to stay ahead of detection. Children were separated from parents and sent into hiding with strangers or religious institutions willing to take the risk. The psychological strain of this constant vigilance was immense. Fear, mistrust, and the threat of betrayal were daily companions. Even minor errors, forgetting a detail on an identity card or hesitating at a checkpoint, could have fatal consequences. The refugees' survival depended not only on luck and resourcefulness, but also on the bravery and commitment of those who risked everything to help them. In occupied France, the Vichy government's collaboration with the Nazis exacerbated the dangers for refugees. French police were often complicit in rounding up Jews for deportation, and bureaucratic procedures were manipulated to ensure compliance with German directives. Internment camps, which had initially provided a measure of shelter, became temporary holding sites before deportation to extermination camps such as Auschwitz. Refugees found themselves trapped in a terrifying paradox. The very authorities that were supposed to protect them often facilitated their persecution. The moral complexity of survival became increasingly apparent. Local citizens were faced with the difficult choice of obeying the occupiers' mandates or risking imprisonment and even death by offering assistance. For many, acts of protection were clandestine, subtle, and dangerous, ranging from providing shelter to forging documents or smuggling families to safer areas. Belgium and the Netherlands experienced similar patterns of escalating peril. Registration, forced labor, and curfews were implemented to restrict the movement of Jews and other targeted populations. Communities that had once offered sanctuary were now under surveillance. Families went to extraordinary lengths to avoid detection, sometimes moving repeatedly in the course of weeks or months. Children were hidden in convents, orphanages, or with sympathetic families, while adults undertook dangerous journeys to join underground networks or evade authorities. Deportation trains became a grim reality, symbolizing both the efficiency of the Nazi machinery and the vulnerability of refugees. Even small acts of defiance, refusing to register, hiding a child, or providing food to the hunted were fraught with danger, yet these acts represented the persistence of humanity under extreme conditions. The war's progression intensified the logistical and emotional challenges of displacement. Refugees were forced to navigate fragmented transportation networks, obtain ration cards under false identities, and adapt to shifting regulations as occupiers adjusted policies to maximize control. Food shortages, overcrowding, and the constant threat of arrest created daily crises. Refugees developed strategies for survival that relied on improvisation, observation, and negotiation. Those with contacts in underground networks could secure temporary safe houses or assistance in moving across regions, while others relied on personal ingenuity, local knowledge, and sheer determination to endure. Community solidarity became a key survival tool, as sharing food, information, or shelter could mean the difference between life and death. Psychological resilience became as vital as physical survival. The constant tension and fear imposed severe stress, often leaving emotional scars that would last long after the war ended. Refugees had to confront the loss of family members, neighbors, and entire communities while maintaining the presence of mind necessary to navigate daily hazards. Coping mechanisms included clandestine education for children, religious observances, and small cultural practices that preserved identity and morale. These acts, though modest in appearance, served as essential affirmations of humanity and continuity in a world designed to strip them away. Resistance movements played an increasingly crucial role during this period. In France, the Comité de Défense des Juifs and other underground organizations coordinated hiding, transportation, and documentation for refugees. Couriers risked arrest to deliver messages or supplies. Sympathetic officials manipulated bureaucratic procedures to protect individuals. Clandestine networks moved entire families to safety. In Belgium and the Netherlands, similar groups operated in secrecy, coordinating with both local civilians and allied contacts to provide escape routes or temporary refuge. The scale and risk of these operations highlight the complexity of survival during this stage of the war. Life depended on careful planning, courage, and the cooperation of multiple actors willing to defy occupiers. Even amid the terror of persecution, refugees found ways to sustain hope. Social and cultural life persisted wherever possible, whether through clandestine schools, religious ceremonies, or improvised artistic activities. These moments of normalcy were vital for maintaining psychological resilience, strengthening family bonds, and preserving a sense of identity. The ability to celebrate a holiday, recite a prayer, or share a meal became acts of resistance against the totalizing control of the occupiers, demonstrating that even in the darkest times, human dignity could endure. By the end of 1943, the refugee experience had evolved from mere displacement to a daily negotiation with persecution, survival, and moral complexity. Families, previously forced to flee, now confronted the ongoing challenge of avoiding detection, securing basic necessities, and preserving cultural and familial identity under conditions designed to destroy both. The lines between survival and resistance blurred, as every act of survival could also be an act of defiance. Children, adults, and elderly alike became participants in a struggle that demanded courage, resourcefulness, and solidarity on an extraordinary scale. The period of intensified persecution also exposed the unevenness of international response. Neutral countries maintained restrictive immigration quotas, delaying or denying refuge to thousands. International organizations struggled to provide aid in a rapidly changing wartime environment, constrained by bureaucracy, limited resources, and political considerations. Refugees had to rely predominantly on their own networks, improvisation, and local solidarity. The war had created a harsh environment where every small advantage information, a hidden attic, a sympathetic neighbor could be decisive. Survival became a daily, often minute-by-minute calculation, dependent on both courage and fortune. The shadows of persecution in this period underscore the terrifying realities of displacement under Nazi occupation. Refugees lived in a world where homes were lost, communities destroyed, and daily life governed by the constant threat of deportation or death. Yet, despite these conditions, they exhibited extraordinary resilience. Families maintained connections, communities created support networks, and individuals undertook enormous risks to protect one another. The story of survival during this phase is not merely one of suffering, it is a testament to human courage, ingenuity, and the capacity for moral action in the face of extreme adversity. Return and reckoning. By 1944, the tide of war began to shift. The Allied forces pushed back across Western Europe, liberating towns and cities one by one. For the millions of displaced civilians and refugees, this was both a moment of hope and a period of uncertainty. Liberation did not instantly erase the hardships of years in hiding, internment, or constant flight. Families returned to towns that were often unrecognizable, homes that had been destroyed or occupied, and communities that had been decimated by deportation, forced labor, or execution. The long journey of displacement had left deep scars, both physical and psychological, and the process of rebuilding would test resilience in entirely new ways. The first challenge was survival in the immediate aftermath of liberation. Food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and ongoing military operations meant that even liberated regions struggled to meet basic needs. Refugees, now returning or emerging from hiding, faced dire conditions, ration cards were limited, housing was scarce, and medical care remained inadequate. Many survivors arrived exhausted, malnourished, or suffering from illness after years of deprivation. In cities across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, families found temporary shelters in community centers, abandoned buildings, or makeshift camps. Aid organizations, including the Red Cross, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, and local charities, coordinated emergency support, providing food, clothing, and medical assistance. Yet despite these efforts, the process of reintegration was slow and fraught with challenges. Reconstruction was complicated by the loss of property, legal entanglements, and bureaucratic obstacles. Many Jewish families returned to find homes, businesses, or land confiscated, destroyed, or occupied by others. Legal systems, overwhelmed by the scale of post-war chaos, often moved slowly in addressing claims for restitution. Survivors were forced to navigate complicated administrative procedures to reclaim property or secure housing, a process that could be emotionally and financially exhausting. Even when restitution was possible, the physical and social environment had been irrevocably altered, neighborhoods were empty, cultural institutions dismantled, and communal networks fractured. For some, rebuilding meant relocating entirely, starting anew in cities, towns, or even abroad. The emotional and psychological impact of prolonged displacement and persecution became increasingly evident. Survivors struggled with grief, trauma, and the challenge of reconnecting with relatives who had been scattered or lost. Children who had grown up in hiding or internment camps faced disrupted education, social disorientation, and emotional scars that affected their adjustment. Adults contended with the weight of survival guilt, mourning the loss of family and friends, and processing the years of fear and uncertainty. Psychologists, social workers, and relief organizations attempted to provide support, yet the scale of trauma was immense, and recovery required long-term efforts on multiple levels. Migration patterns shifted once more as refugees sought new opportunities and safety beyond Europe. Displaced persons, particularly Jews, were often reluctant to remain in countries where they had been persecuted, even after liberation. Many emigrated to Palestine, the United States, Canada, or South America, seeking stability, security, and the possibility of rebuilding their lives in communities where they could live without fear. These movements were facilitated by emerging international policies on refugee resettlement, but were still limited by quotas, political constraints, and logistical challenges. Emigration became both a practical necessity and an opportunity to reclaim agency after years of forced displacement. The social fabric of liberated regions faced the daunting task of reconciliation. Communities that had collaborated with occupiers, whether through bureaucratic enforcement or opportunistic actions, were scrutinized and sometimes punished. Refugees returning to their former towns often encountered mixed reactions. Neighbors who had survived the occupation in place might offer assistance, resentment, or indifference. The process of rebuilding trust, re-establishing communal bonds, and confronting complicity was delicate and emotionally charged. For many refugees, reintegration required navigating complex social dynamics, balancing the need for survival with the moral weight of memory and justice. Education and cultural revival became central to rebuilding life after displacement. Schools reopened, and communities worked to restore libraries, religious institutions, and cultural centers that had been disrupted or destroyed. Children and young adults, many of whom had experienced years of interrupted learning, required accelerated education and emotional support. Cultural events, performances, and religious celebrations helped reinforce a sense of identity and continuity, preserving traditions that had been threatened by the war. These initiatives were vital in re-establishing not just material stability, but also the psychological and communal foundations necessary for long-term recovery. The long-term consequences of displacement were profound. Survivors carried the physical scars of malnutrition, illness, and deprivation, alongside enduring psychological trauma. Socially, communities were forever altered, populations were smaller, neighborhoods had shifted, and the bonds that once defined local life were fragmented. Economically, refugees faced the challenge of rebuilding livelihoods in landscapes where pre-war businesses and networks had disappeared. Politically, the experiences of persecution and displacement fueled movements advocating for human rights, refugee protections, and the prevention of future atrocities. The lessons of displacement during World War II would shape international law, social policy, and collective memory for decades to come. Yet amid loss and trauma, stories of resilience and courage persisted. Refugees rebuilt schools, businesses, and communities, preserved traditions and cultural identity, and formed new networks that sustained them in the post-war era. Families reunited, albeit often partially, and survivors nurtured the next generation with the lessons learned from years of displacement. The ability to endure, adapt, and rebuild in the aftermath of systemic persecution stands as a testament to human resilience. These narratives of survival underscore not only the horrors of forced displacement but also the enduring capacity for hope, solidarity, and renewal in the wake of devastation. In The Final Reckoning, the story of refugees and displaced populations during World War II is one of both tragedy and tenacity. Millions were uprooted, scattered, and subjected to unimaginable suffering. Entire communities were destroyed, families fractured, and cultural landscapes permanently altered. Yet, through determination, solidarity, and resourcefulness, survivors navigated the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Their journey from flight and hiding, through the challenges of persecution, to the painstaking process of rebuilding, illuminates both the depths of human cruelty and the extraordinary